This is Restless. Welcome back to Restless. I am your host on this post-mortem of the young, restless, and reformed. I am joined today by a deer slayer, Pastor Michael.
Yeah,
Michael,
I did. I shot a deer. It was not a big one, but it was exactly what I was looking for as far as meat for my family. So Matt and I actually were hunting together, and I shot one. Matt saw two. I don't know. Does that freak people out that listen to this, maybe? I don't know. What kind of people do we have? Are they people that would think hunting is cool? Are they people that think that's kind of gross? I don't know.
I don't know. But it felt like a good intro.
We went hunting, and so I hope that y'all are okay with that. Otherwise, Matt, delete it.
Yeah. We will do our best. So today what we are going to discuss is an important subject to New Calvinism, and a subject that I think fits along with Winsome Winter, where we are reaching out and we are explaining more and more subjects to a wider audience. As we know, our audience has continued to grow with more of the Driscoll content we're doing, which we will get back to the brand next week. But today we want to discuss evangelicalism, because we often talk about the young Calvinist movement being an evangelical movement. We call ourselves evangelicals. But at the end of this episode, I'm going to ask Pastor Michael if, after all of our discussion, if he's an evangelical, which is a thing I think a lot of people are wondering these days. The definition seems to be in question. There's other terms we also use that are really related. People talk about evangelical culture, right? These are our discussions in the past of this being a Christian nationalist culture, that it's primarily a political thing. We'll talk a little bit about evangelical culture. And the final thing is a term we use pretty frequently, and we know what we mean, but it might be helpful for our listeners if we describe what is Big Eva. Pastor Michael, how do you feel about venturing out?
Let's do it. Let's get into these evangelical waters. I'm actually looking forward to this because as I think about it, I use the word in many different ways. And so it will be interesting to kind of dissect a little bit more and find out where exactly you are taking us on this one.
Yeah, I will do my best. Again, this is the kind of subject that we could read. You could read, many academic works at this point on, because of how much there really is to say. Historians like Mark Knoll, who I'm sure Pastor Michael would be familiar with, an older guy named David Bebbington, who we will get into, they've written a ton on these kinds of subjects. And so this is going to might feel somewhat cursory, but we hope that it can be an ongoing resource for people going, kind of, what is an evangelical? How do they fit? How do we fit with them? And so let's start with where the term, kind of originated. The very far back, we'll go really far back and then we'll come kind of close to the present. The first way the term evangelical was really ever used was actually in German by Luther. Pastor Michael, you're nodding like you understand what we're describing.
Yeah. So this is kind of the historic root as it was used early on in the Reformation to distinguish a lot of what was going on there.
Yeah. And because it roots itself in the word, the Evangel, which is obviously the good news.
Yep. So the idea of the Evangelion, right? This is this word that we speak of as the gospel or the good news, and so it became a distinguishing marker of those early on in the Reformation as those who were, It took on. You'll have to remind me. Did it start off as, was Luther the first to use it, or was it used against him? Do you remember?
I believe.
I think I'm just mixing it up with Protestant, because Protestant I know was used originally as like a slander, right?
Right.
And then it was just kind of it stuck a little bit. Whereas this makes more sense that it would be something that Luther would come up as a term for what they were doing, right? They're rediscovering the gospel. That's what we're doing. We're people of the gospel. And that makes a lot of sense.
Right. And so, obviously, the kind of evangelicalism we are discussing is actually very very different than what would have been what Luther meant when he used the term evangelical. We are discussing a trend that, if you want to go basically as far back as we could, it would be uh, the 17th century, but probably the 18th century religion in America revivals time. Is if we were to reach back into time and actually say, where does evangelicalism kind of begin, it's probably in that time period. Would you think, when Pastor Michael, you're not using the historical technical definition, but if you think back growing up as an evangelical, would you say that's a pretty fair, like, where we are going back to?
Yeah, where did evangelicalism begin, or something like that? So the various ways that I was presented with evangelicalism, often it had roots in, number one, pietism, so which did go back to
17th
Germany.
century, yep.
But 17th century, and then especially working through Lutheran churches, and then in immigrant communities in the U.S. And kind of spreading from there. And then also you have the kind of especially Baptist, but not exclusively Baptist movements coming out of some of the more revivalistic elements of the First Great Awakening, then especially the Second Great Awakening, and a lot of the of Baptist revivalistic movements there. These things kind of converging actually together to become what we now think of more so as modern day evangelicalism.
So if we look at where David Bebbington, and he is a historian from Cambridge, and he wrote a number of the early books, historical books on evangelicalism, and he cites one of the things, he cites a very early encounter of evangelicalism being during the First Great Awakening, because the connection he is making is, he says, the dynamicism of the evangelical movement was possible only because of the inherents being assured of their salvation. And so he describes the First Great Awakening's emphasis and discussion of the assurance of salvation as a major part of it. Obviously, we have things like from the Second Great Awakening, where we start seeing very large churches in America. We see a pretty ardent premillennialism that often is associated with evangelicalism. And so I would say, if we're talking historically, that is where we begin to get what is evangelicalism. So David Bebbington wrote in a book called Evangelicalism in Modern Britain, and he also describes this in America. He wrote this, what's called the Bebbington Quadrilateral. If you remember when we talked to Brad Vermeulen about his book on the New Calvinism, he pulls from Bebbington's work to describe even what's going on in the New Calvinism. And so Bebbington describes 4 things he thought were essential for something to be described as part of the overall evangelical movement for the last 200 years. And here are the 4 things. He said, number 1, biblicism, as in a particular regard to the Bible. So this is some idea of the Bible being the authority. Crucocentrism, a focus on the atoning work of Christ on the cross. Conversionism, the belief that human beings need to be converted. And activism, the belief that the gospel needs to be expressed in effort. And that activism, it can include care for the poor, these kinds of things, but also missions work. So Pastor Michael, when you look at this now nearly 50-year-old definition of evangelicalism, what do you think about that as a description of evangelical doctrine?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard it very many times put exactly this way, no doubt using Bebbington. Sometimes, actually, talking about, maybe directly quoting him. Maybe other times it's literally just, it's in the water, right? So that people just talk about it. For instance, I knew someone who would say, I'm an evangelical because I'm all about the Bible and I'm all about the cross. So like breaking it down that way, and so that makes a lot of sense. Even just thinking about, the activism being primarily missionary work, kind of flowing out of, a typical understanding of conversionism, right? So it makes sense that people that are believing these things are going to become a particular kind of activists. So anyway, it's just it makes sense to me. It's what I've more or less always heard, at least as far as the more intellectual kind of higher brow. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about evangelicals, breaking it down that way.
So the problem, we'll say this quadrilateral has come into under attack recently as a good definition of evangelicalism. I think because, in my mind, the biggest issue with these things are they're all very abstract. Mm-hmm. They're very abstract.
Right. Yeah, because there's a way in which, I mean, even, as we sit here and talk about it, I can think of, historic Reformed churches or, some, thinking about the First Great Awakening, for instance, and the response to some of the things within the First Great Awakening that we could probably connect to all four of these things. That was seen as problematic by some of the more, some of the institutional churches. And you start to see some of the breakdown there, and obviously this, grows in between the First and Second Great Awakening, and it's just, a lot of these things are just taken for granted once you get around to the Second Great Awakening. It's just like some of it's just assumed. But when you're talking about like conversionism, it's like, well, obviously I want people to be converted, but this plays out in a very particular way a lot of the times. Activism, well, I want people to be active in their faith. I want Christians to be active in the world. Oh, but what exactly does that look like? That's going to be different, right? What does it look like to send missionaries? Being all about the cross. Okay, great. Like I feel like I'm, very much about Christ's work of atonement on the cross, and also his, resurrection, and also his ascension, and so much, more beyond that. So it really just depends, I guess, on how you, are going to break these down. So that makes sense that you would say that it's under some scrutiny anyway for that reason.
And what I will say is, now this is not from Brad Vermerlen, so this is my own perspective on one of the big things that was happening in New Calvinism is it was looking at these kinds of distinctives of evangelicalism. There's a battle over how we're going to define them, how we're going to go forward, and these men place themselves in influential places. I think what they essentially were trying to do is we are going to become the definers of this quadrilateral, or we might say they're going to add a few things to the quadrilateral. And what I think they decided they were going to add is, if you listen to Ligon Duncan and Mark Dever in that interview we listened to, and Al Mohler, where they keep saying things like, where else are young evangelicals going to find someone teaching the traditional sexual ethic, the inerrancy of the Bible, expositional preaching, and big God? I think what they decided they were going to do is, we are going to come to evangelicalism and we are going to lead it, and we are going to make it explicitly inerrant. We are going to make it have a Calvinistic soteriology, and we are going to defend a traditional sexual ethic. I think that is one of the things they were attempting to do.
To add within this framework. Yeah.
And try and make these essential to evangelicalism.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Pastor Michael, when you think of an evangelical church, when you think of evangelicalism, do you think primarily in terms of these kinds of doctrines?
No. So I was saying this earlier that as we started preparing for this and recording it, I realized that I really use the term evangelical in very distinctly different ways, and it depends on the context of the conversation that I'm in. So I will sometimes use the term evangelical to talk about us evangelicals, meaning basically some kind of like Bible believing Christian, right? Just like some kind of like baseline, like I just believe some very basic, like I trust the Bible, I believe in Jesus, I've repented of my sins and trusted in him, and that's basically it. But like that is a distinctive, in our world, and so just sometimes I think about it like that. So like, okay, yeah, as evangelicals, I will speak in that language. Sometimes I use evangelical, and listen, I'm sorry out there for you who are, deeply in the evangelical world, but sometimes I use it as kind of like a negative identifier. Like I'll say like, oh, that's just like an evangelical. This is just what evangelicals do. And usually when I use it in that way, I've recognized that what I really mean is, a kind of church or faith that is very emotionally driven and self-centered, or focused on kind of self-fulfillment in some way or something like that. And so I've used it that way, or talking about like evangelical worship or something like that. I might use it in those terms to talk about this kind of hyper individualized understanding of worship in the Christian life. And so like I know that I've used it those ways, and I would also then add that probably I've started to use it sometimes within the political sphere, like as it's been used often as kind of a designation for particular political beliefs. I might not use it exactly how like a Washington Post would use it or something like that, but I do like tend to see it as like maybe I use it in this way. Maybe I would use it more as a cultural term rather than a term designating something about certain kinds of Christians. Put it that way.
And this is what I think is very important. Maybe we're going to go to the second layer of our understanding of evangelical, is because I think, and I'll ask Pastor Michael, on those most basic levels of doctrine, this is why we would talk about us evangelicals, and perhaps we would say us conservative evangelicals, identifying with the fact that, hey, whatever they were trying to throw in to that quadrilateral, we're with them on that too, right? We're like, yeah, you should call it inerrant, traditional sexual ethics and stuff. But there's this second level, which is, I think, if we call the first one evangelical doctrine, this is the evangelicals. This is the cultural level. That is something that those four things do not make a culture. Now, the National Association of Evangelicals literally has those four things as basically their statement of beliefs, which is really interesting. But any evangelical church, while those things, even if they were to say, yeah, these are the most important things to us, they're not the most common, they're not the most open. There are cultural things. And this is one thing I think is really striking, and maybe we'll talk about this movement in itself. Evangelicals rarely begin by saying, you know what I started rejecting and decided I wasn't an evangelical anymore? Activism or the authority of the Bible or things. Now, maybe the authority of the Bible is one, but they actually start with cultural concerns.
Yeah, so there's cultural pressure in this particular area, or like, I have all of these, gay friends or, transgender friends, and they have questions about their place in the church. And that makes me question why are people saying that, what they're doing isn't right, and so on and so forth. And so it begins kind of taking you down that road, or it's political, right? So it's well, I don't like that, evangelicalism is all about voting for Republicans. So right. I need to like stop doing that, and maybe that makes me not an evangelical. So now I'm an evangelical because I'm moving this political direction, which usually is also then connected to other things. Obviously, not it's never something they just do alone. But yeah. So I see how you could say that there's definitely cultural issues that drive a lot of that kind of movement.
So I'm going to share two kinds of critiques of the quadrilateral. One from what we might describe as a more reformed person looking at evangelicals, saying, here's how I would actually define you. And then we're going to look at someone from perhaps on the left, and maybe Michael and I, if we grew up in an evangelical church, we may throw out a few topics and say if we think there's a pretty something that would seem like a consistent cultural outworking of evangelicalism. Because I think on none of these lists have I found premillennialism.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was so central, right? That was unbelievably central.
The rapture and return of Christ, right? That was one of the created one of the best-selling book series of all time. Yeah. That was an evangelical phenomenon, right? So, Pastor Michael, do you want to start with from the left or from the right?
Let's go with the right first.
Great. So this person said we need to come up with a new, quote unquote, new quadrilateral. And so they're actually still kind of trying to work from what was presented there. But anyway, so they would say that one of the things that actually defines evangelicals is interdenominational activism. So we need to, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of some cause, we need to lay down all our our denominational distinctives, which is why you find people who will describe themselves as evangelicals in Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterian. Now we've literally and this is why I think this has a lot of force on this one. The non-denominational movement that is an evangelical thing, right? We need to disconnect from those so much. It's not we can just work with the churches around town. It's we need to lose denominations as evangelicals.
Yeah, interesting. Right.
So the next one he said is a heightened belief in revival. So he's saying they're not saying all people need to be converted. He's saying this is conversion is a revivalistic experience. That there is a focus on conversion as a experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where we talk about conversionism being an almost unhelpful term, because how do you define it? I want people to be converted. I want people to come to Christ. However, in evangelical circles, there is a very distinctive understanding of what it means to be converted, and it is usually supposed to be this large experiential kind of a thing. Now, there are people in the evangelical world that would obviously want to say, well, we want to get away from that, or we want to push against that, or whatever. But generally speaking, that is the case. It needs to be this exciting experience.
Let me actually read the definition from the National Association of Evangelicals, and I think they're pretty close to this. That the belief that lives need to be transformed through a born-again experience and a lifelong process of following Jesus. Right? They insert the word experience. I think you are in many ways an evangelical if your understanding of being born again was primarily in experiential terms.
Yeah, it was a particular experience that I can remember, I can tell you about, I can explain what happened to me. Like, that is what a conversion is.
Right. And we're not saying that can't be a conversion.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
But the idea that is a conversion, or even in evangelism on campuses to students who are from a more traditional background, why don't you just pray this kind of conversionary moment just to make sure, right? That kind of, we can kind of really guarantee it at that point. I would say that the next two are both related, but again, none of these lists are perfect, but I think they help us shed light, right? It's they have an instrumental view of doctrine. So we need doctrine that we'd call that is applicable. Doctrine is interesting as far as it allows us to make some point or is applicable out in the world.
Yeah, and so this is really just taking activism and making it a little bit more specific, right? So you're taking doctrine is for the purpose of activism.
Yes. And this would be, for example, they would say why maybe the very technical or more the doctrine of the Trinity or the doctrine of God is not going to get as much emphasis because those are less like, I can go apply that to my marriage.
Yep, right. So yeah, absolutely.
And let me just say, as far as we go, as far as that is true, that is a problem, because knowing God is the ultimate purpose of doctrine. Yep. That is the ultimate privilege we've been given.
Yep.
Not having a better marriage, but knowing God as he's revealed himself. And then the final one is this is why it's really related to it, is a de-emphasis on anything that is not soteriology.
Yeah, and that makes sense. That if your focus is the cross and people converting, and if you want something that is directly applicable to what you're trying to do, all you're going to be talking about is, okay, how do we get people saved? That's the focus. Right. Which when I think about, okay, if I just try to work out the sermons and various like devotionals or anything like that I've heard over the years within evangelical context, almost exclusively, I would say, has to do with soteriology, almost exclusively. Which is also why one of the primary kind of controversies comes up is Calvinism versus Arminianism, right? Like that's one of the primary, this is our controversy. This is the big fight. This is how you find out who you're dealing with, right? Who you're talking to, where they stand. Are they a Calvinist or an Arminian? So that makes sense.
So let's go to the left and see what they say. So here was again, it's for everyone's kind of playing off the quadrilateral. Yeah. is the first one, moralism. Enforcing moral convictions, especially on a few select issues like abortion and homosexuality.
Yep. Leave it to the left to just say it's all about that, which,
Now, I do think there is some truth to this idea of a increased emphasis on, I'd just say sexual purity in general.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's for sure. And could I just say that maybe part of that is because maybe how I would define a lot of evangelical culture is very reactionary, and so it's not building its own thing really. It's it's kind of reacting to the world around it. In which case, when you have a world that is quickly running into things like abortion and homosexuality or other kinds of just like fornication and any kind of sexual promiscuity, that you would have the reaction of like maybe a strong purity culture or something like that.
Next, ethnocentrism, defending religious freedom and instituting informal civic religion of the United States of America, a form of Christianity that reflects white culture.
Yeah, so this doesn't make any sense to me because the evangelical movement is huge outside of the U.S. It's huge in like Hispanic populations and things like that. I mean, it's like when you're talking about like the growth of evangelical churches and denominations and movements, it's not like this purely like American thing. Although there is maybe a distinct American evangelicalism that when you think of, I don't know, there's what's that guy's name who does like the Republican services and stuff like that, like who I'm talking about, down in Texas, big mega church guy. He has like it's like American flags and eagles all over. Who am I talking about? Do you know?
Oh, man,
I can't remember his name. Help us out, if you can think of it. But he's always on like Fox News and stuff talking about the loss of faith in America. But then you see like his church services and it's like it's literally just singing America songs and like you just don't care about what is actually biblical. So if you're talking about that kind of thing, there is a kind of civic religion that's developed out of evangelicalism. But I would not necessarily like make that like one in the same. You know, like I would want to distinguish that a little bit from evangelicalism itself. Maybe that's like a part of it, but it's not definitive of it.
Here's one thing I would say tends to be part of evangelicalism, and people really bristle at this, and I'm actually going to defend it. Right, there were, at the church I grew up in, there were occasional voter guides handed out in upcoming elections that tended to say you should vote Republican. But what I'm not really willing to hear, and again, I know there are crazy abuses of it. I know there is a civic religion that is insane. Is no one I knew had, now other than maybe support for Israel because of dispensationalism, no one had a super spiritual view of what they were doing in politics. It was, well, I know the Republicans at least say they're against abortion, gay marriage, and a lot of them and they
say that they're Christians,
and say they're Christian and say they'll defend religious liberty. I don't really have, most of the evangelicals I knew were not particularly political, more political than say their neighbors on the left or anyone else. They just knew this is kind of what we do. We vote this way because of these issues that line up with Christianity that the other side will never come close to. Yeah. And they didn't have it wasn't a controlling concern overall.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just can't think of any like evangelical pastor that I've ever known that has made politics like the big thing from the right. Mm-hmm. I know plenty of like left-leaning evangelicals that make everything about politics, but I don't know it the other way. And I'm sure it was that way at times. Right. I'm sure that happened in some places, and I know that's the overarching concern. And I do tend to think that there was a blurring of like well, to be an evangelical means to be a Republican at times. But as far as like on the ground level, I can't think of a lot of like political activism that happened in the evangelical circles I was ever a part of.
Right. Well, and I'll hit these last two at you fast so we can move on to Big Eva. Authoritarianism, demanding an absolute commitment to those in authority as long as they preserve the moralistic and ethnocentric vision of America. This one, I'm sorry,
I don't see it at all.
If anything, evangelicals are almost anti any authority.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Well, what's interesting is what I would say, to be very winsome about this, is that where you could see this is in places like we talk about this with like a Mars Hill and a Driscoll, or like certain figures in evangelicalism, because there's no accountability system, there's no authority structure really set up.
Yes.
There are some men, or even women probably, who can like find their way at the center of this and really take charge, really take power, and then they themselves can be very authoritarian and kind of even totalitarian in how they try to operate and run the church. However, that's like very few cases, like as far as I'm concerned. Well, maybe not very few cases.
And every time it happens, it's like
tons of people leave.
And it's an allergy, and we all hate it, and we're going to make podcasts to condemn it and talk about how bad it is.
Yeah, that's right. So it's like I can't think of like authoritarianism being within any of the evangelical like movements that I was ever a part of personally.
So if what we might say is the structurelessness of evangelicals' doctrine of the church allows for this, the answer might be yes.
Right. Yeah, and even like, at times is like it leaves room for this kind of thing to happen. Like it provides a situation where somebody who wants to do this can do it very easily. Mm-hmm. However, it does not seem like this is very common culturally on the ground level anyway.
And then the final one this person offers is consumerism, enjoying without interruption their distinct brand of crossless consumer Christianity. One, it's not crossless.
It's all crosses.
Everything's cross.
It's all crosses.
Again, I do think
there is right.
There is
this
consumerism.
Is totally right. 100%. Did you ever watch Bible Man?
Right.
I mean, come on. Hey, if you didn't watch Bible Man, there's another like live stream we have to do sometime.
Sure. Oh yeah.
Man, that would be rough.
Oh yeah.
That would be brutal. Bible Man, for those of you who did not grow up in these contexts, is like a superhero guy who fights villains by being like the Bible Man, and he's got like the belt of truth. This is like real, like live action recorded. So these are real people doing this. Yep. And he's like a superhero that goes and fights some evil villain. I don't remember who or anything about it except that it was Bible Man.
Yeah. I'm going to say this. I'm going to go back to our episode and I'm going to list this, and maybe we will do a bonus sometime where I share, as we've talked this through. I think this has been really helpful with the hallmarks of evangelicalism. I'm just going to grab a couple that I actually think we just haven't gotten yet. Is I think one thing that makes you an evangelical is because fundamentalist tends to be an insult in evangelical circles. Yep. And so what I think oftentimes it's we agree with the fundamentalists on doctrine, inerrancy, all the kinds of things therefore, but not in how they practice it, not in how they present it.
But we're nice.
Right. So, Pastor Michael, one thing that wasn't listed here is there a distinctive kind of belief about worship in evangelicals? What do you think?
Yeah, so I don't know that there's a particular belief, although we've discussed it in the past when we discussed the work that you did talking about different kinds of worship and the regulative principle. But I do think that there is a pretty clear personal, individual, experiential element to worship, right? So it's all about the personal, individual interaction with whatever happens.
Yes. I think that is very clear, and I think that's why evangelical worship tends to turn over generationally.
Yep.
Because what's driving the decisions being made are the personal and the experiential things going on, and those things do turn over. The kinds of things that I personally experience and I prefer are very much tied to place and people, and this is why when evangelicals started, they were holding a guitar but singing with hymn books, and we're far from that now, because and I think that's an important point, right? There's things like the emphasis on personal testimony. I think maybe the only other one I'll mention, because we even already talked about them being nice people, is I think that evangelicals tend to together, I think because of the modernist fundamentalist controversies and the ongoing theological liberalism, is there is a allergy to anything that feels or looks like the traditional denominations, or we might call it the main line. I think there's maybe one other hallmark I don't think I've really heard that I, growing up in it, really thought I didn't think there was an evangelical in a traditional Lutheran church or a traditional Wesleyan church. Now, I had very limited experience in other denominations, but that would be something I would add.
Yeah, absolutely. And anytime you see, maybe a more traditional church with a traditional liturgy, it was assumed this is a dead church.
Yes,
because it doesn't have that personal experiential element, and a lot of the other focuses that, we've kind of talked about here.
So the final piece of this I want to help is because people hear us say it. So I hope you're getting hooks for evangelical doctrine, what makes someone an evangelical, or the things that go on in an evangelical. I think the final thing that you need to understand as the conversations about evangelicalism go on is, what is Big Eva? How do we use that term? Pastor Michael, we've used that term a good amount on our show. When you say Big Eva, and if you don't anymore, if you've abandoned it, maybe you have, what does it mean? How do you use that term?
So I'm pretty sure, and I'm sure that you'll pull some of this up. I'm pretty sure the first time I ever heard the term was from Carl Trueman, and he was talking. It might have even been when he's discussing the problems of like the YRR and like Together for the Gospel and these big conferences and things like that. But talking about this, I know you're going to bring up this term too. I'm just going to use it because I think it helps make sense of it.
Mm-hmm.
But when we talk about Big Eva, we're talking about what has also been termed at times the evangelical industrial complex. So this idea that there are all of these, kind of major players and institutions and publishers and seminaries and bigwigs in particular denominations and conferences and conference circuits then that all kind of work together. They're all interacting regularly. And so you have kind of a development even without having like complete agreement on everything or something like that. You end up having this very like closed system where there's very much a clear like an in and an out, right? There are those guys that are in, and they're the guys that they write a book, and you got 15 to 20 book endorsements from every other person in this circuit, even if it becomes clear that they probably did not read this book.
Right.
But they still endorse it. Why is that? It's because you're one of them, right? You're in the circles. You're part of Big Eva. You're part of the group. So I don't know. You can probably that's what I'm referring to when I've ever used it. But you can probably give us a better definition.
I think that is a pretty fair description of it. Carl Trueman just says it. It's his term, and now many people's term, for the network of large evangelical organizations and conferences that hope to shape the thinking and strategy of American evangelical churches. And so oftentimes when we use it, and oftentimes when it is used, I actually think it's often viewed in somewhat of a derogatory way. But
it is, right. I mean, we use it in a very derogatory way.
But it doesn't necessarily have to be.
Yeah.
Right? When it's just a group of people seeking to shape evangelical thinking, in many ways you could say our podcast is doing that on a tiny, non-big
come on, don't play us down,
industrial level.
We're changing the business. We're changing it all.
But that's what it is. And so the people who I think bristle at this term know it is being used to criticize them. And so that's Carl Trueman's term. I think the two other ways you might hear it described is, yes, the evangelical industrial complex, which most people credit to the Lutheran discernment guy, Chris Roseborough, right? A network of Christian media, published words, and ministry partners, which rely on each other for promotion, book deals, conferences, networking, income, right? And then the third one, which I haven't heard as much recently, but calling it the Evangelical Intelligentsia, which actually is rooted in a study that was actually done at Boston College a while ago, and was used by Pulpit and Pen, which is probably why we can't use that one in polite company anymore. But Pastor Michael, why does this third term... So sometimes I think when people say evangelicals, they actually mean this group of people.
Because they're kind of the movers and shakers. They're the guys on top.
Right, that's
usually.
why this is being included in this show. Why does this term and understanding what this term kind of matter?
That's a good question. So I guess it simply comes down to, like, when you're talking about like kind of the elites within this movement, they are the ones that are really defined. I mean, the the books that people read are books written by these people. I mean, it's the movers and shakers, the people on top. And so, in other words, the primary elements of what any given evangelical believes is probably going to be massively influenced by these authors and speakers and pastors and seminary professors and whatever else, whoever else we want to include in here. It's going to be influenced by those people. They are the voices for the movement, put it that way.
Yeah. So one more quote from Carl Trueman here. Big Eva, it's to repeat one of my mantras, Big Eva is built around big conferences and big personalities. Neither need be problematic. I have enjoyed the occasional big conference and have profited from books by big names. What is problematic is that some of these conferences and their co-contaminant celebrities have intentional significance beyond offering a time of some fellowship and good teething. It's a populist extra ecclesiastical game. It's building momentum via conferences, networks, and its own stable celebrities. And if there's part of it's going bad, Big Eva responds, as it usually does, with an alternative conference or some blog posts or yet another statement or petition where the boundaries will be more sharply drawn, right? That this is what Carl Trueman is seeing as big evangelicalism.
Yeah, really interesting. We love that guy. We got to try to get him on sometime. We'll work on it.
Yeah. I do think, again, that it's this extra ecclesiastical game, which is a very evangelical thing. And here is, in most recent years, if you want to know quite honestly why people bristle at this term, it's because what nobody likes is the big evangelicalism, or Big Eva, is criticized for the way it's trying to shape people's minds, and that nobody wants to be, on the wrong side of that. Because usually when Big Eva is mentioned, it's, hey, someone out in flyover country like us are noticing a way that a group of people with influence who are promoting each other and making it sound like a consensus are trying to shape the thinking.
What also makes it problematic a lot of times is that it's because there's no distinct authority structure or accountability system. You have guys who will, write books, get all the endorsements. They'll have the blog on TGC or wherever. So think of a Tulin Chavidian. I don't know that I said his name right. Who knows how to say the name? If you know, go ahead and write in. But a guy like this who he is well accepted in these circles, and gets all the endorsements and everything, and then starts teaching very false doctrine, and there's just a slow we'll just kind of push him off to the side, but there's no direct authority structure within this movement that would say, hey, we can't believe that stuff. We don't want to hold to those things. Maybe individual authors or blogs or something like that, but there is no definitive, hey, this is what we believe, this is what we don't believe. It's all based on those personalities. And then there's nobody to take accountability when things go bad. There's nobody who is all right, well, I guess I lost my job because I platformed this guy who turns out to be a total whack job,
Right. And so it's this, and it's more than that. It's a protectionistic system. Trueman, in another post, he calls it a fiefdom. Big Eva runs like a personal fiefdom of a few, even though many decent people are involved at various mastheads are unaware of this. But to cross the few or touch their dogmatic golden calves, you can expect the fight back to be dirty, relentless, and increasingly dangerous, largely hidden from the watching world.
Wow, yeah, you're totally shut out because you've called out certain things.
And
which, by the way, is not what we're doing. So if you would like to publish a book from Restless sometime,
that's right.
We're just explaining what other people think.
That's right. We are not touching any of the golden calves Crossway might have if they want to publish anything we ever write. But what it's saying is there is a goal for people to be brought. You, to get your book, to get notoriety, you are brought into the big evangelical circle, which is then becomes your credence. How do you know I'm Orthodox?
I'm with these people.
I'm with them.
Yeah, it's what we've talked about in the past, right? These big names become the standard of orthodoxy.
And then there is suspicion on those criticizing the Orthodox, the Big Eva, this, and it becomes this defending, promoting, and shaping thing. And what people in the pews, I might say, or online are recognizing what it seems people are recognizing at every level of American society, that there is a disconnect from the elite and everyone else. And there may even be an overproduction of elites at this point. This is a divide that is being felt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think this is a really helpful way to look at it. And, maybe it's one of those terms that is not the most well-defined, but I think, like, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, maybe we can't come up with, like, a paragraph exact definition, like, and what all is included in this, but you know it when you see it. You know exactly what we're talking about when you see it.
Right.
So one of the things, as we start to draw this to a close, that I think we should stress is that, we've kind of gone through various different definitions and even said we use terms like Big Eva, for instance, in maybe a more negative way, and sometimes use evangelical in a more negative way. But this in no way means that we are trying to cast shade on the faithful evangelicals and the faithful evangelical churches and pastors and people that have shaped us and formed us and helped us. Even though what I would say, based on especially our later definitions here of evangelical, if we're just talking about the quadrilateral, I would probably be able to say, yeah, I'm an evangelical. With some of these later definitions, I would have to say that probably there's at least some way in which I am not an evangelical. I'm not totally on with a lot of this anymore, and that has changed. Though again, like the normal way that a lot of people I know use it, like, hey, I'm just a Bible believing Christian. Yeah, me too. We're evangelicals then. But even though I don't think that I would term myself an evangelical any longer, like that's not how I define what I believe to most people. Unless you have this kind of context, But I'm so grateful for those evangelical ministers and ministries that have shaped me, formed me, and really want to make that clear. And in fact, I think we should do a whole episode on how that can be the case.
Yes. I think the reason you are thankful for this is actually the precise reason this gets so much attention. Why do people focus on Big Eva? Why is the media trying to write about evangelicals? I was reading, it might have been on a tweet thread of a guy in academia saying that all of the professors, all of these atheistic professors in the religious studies department were raised in evangelical churches and are now constantly trying to reprocess everything they experienced through it. Why is that? Because he basically said this is the power of evangelical religion. And why does evangelical religion have power? Some people might say it has, right? People are obviously saying it has power from ethnocentrism or sociological perspectives or a certain amount of, we even describe Big Eva having a certain amount of wealth, influence, and power. But that is not the power of evangelical religion that we should all be grateful for. The power of evangelical religion is that for whatever you like or don't like about these churches held to the gospel and the word of God in a time where people were being offered many other alternatives.
Yeah.
And those people are gone, and the evangelicals are still here to be criticized or praised or have power or have money. And that is an unquestionably powerful thing because it's the power of the gospel. It is the power of Jesus, which is what, in the end, they probably would want to be known for anyways.
That's right.
Thanks for listening to us discuss evangelicalism, evangelicals, and Big Eva, Pastor Michael.
We did it. Hope that it was helpful and that you enjoyed it. If you have your own definition of evangelical that you want to share, please send it our way. We'll try to work through some of those if you've got some.